Hello everybody. I'm sharing in this virtual lecture something about my own experience in the Austrian school system, with a particular relevance, of course, which is important for our project on teacher education. And I will start now with giving you some overview on what the history of the Austrian school system is all about. And I will give you first a brief outline of the system, which goes back to the Josephinian time, the era when the government started to view education as a political concern and not just leave it to particular people who thought particular people in the big nation were important for that. And it was Empress Maria Theresia in 1774 who has really a very important influence on the system, because she introduced the compulsory school system. And this was done through the school edict for all German regular main and trivial schools in all imperial and royal dominions. And at that time, the royal dominions was quite a big part of Europe. If you look at the former Austrian-Hungarian territory, which covered quite a lot of what is now Europe, if you look at this small print where you see the green part covered. So that was quite a large area which was relevant and influenced from the Austrian school system. I hope you are all with me. Can you hear what I'm talking about?
They can type.
Can you type if you can hear what's going on, so that I know that you are with me presenting this? Yes, I see a thumb going up. Thank you, Katrin, for letting me know. So we will continue here. You see on the left bottom picture, this is what has been left by Austria from this originally huge Austrian-Hungarian empire. And yet, talking about the Austrian school system nowadays, there is lots of influences which go back to the roots of that system. We are now in the very west of Austria, Innsbruck. That's where the ELTE, the Edite people are positioned now, and this is where the office is, where you can get this virtual lecture from. And you see this is about a distance from Vienna, about 500 kilometers away. Now, let's go further into the issue and look at some pictures just to see historically how things have changed. And it was important in 1867 that academic freedom in science and teaching was enacted. And this was very important because it's still an influence through the Imperial Primary Schools Act, which has relevance to the Austrian system when it was passed in that time in 1869. And ever since, the objectives of school education have been clearly defined so as to provide all children, irrespective of their gender, their social situation, their origin, or their denomination, with the best possible education and a variety of educational opportunities. Now, let's recap. 1774, Maria Theresia, the Empress, introduced compulsory education, which at that time was very unique all over Europe. And if you think of the United States, the school system did not exist at that time at all, just to give you a perspective from this. Then we have a huge jump now to 1918. This is the end of the empire. the king had to resign, and this is when Otto Glöckl, socialist minister of education, wanted optimal education for all children, regardless of gender and age. And he's quite known as the person who wanted to introduce compulsory education as a first step after the fall of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Now we have another big jump to 1975, and it took that long that single-sex schools were abolished and co-educational state schools were the rule all over Austria. And as a next date, it's the Integration Act in 1993 to integrate all children with special needs. If we go on now, we talk about the democratic policy making in education in Austria, which has actually a very short span of time. Empress Maria Theresia introduced the compulsory school system during the monarchy, but then there was this big step into 1918, which was the end of World War I, when the school system of the monarchy was continued. So it was only a very slow transition of school laws in the so-called then First Republic. Then, of course, when it went towards the Second World War, the school laws of the German Reich were introduced, and they did away with that little development which we had seen in the slow transition of the First Republic. And by the end of the Second World War, again, the school laws of the First Republic before 1933 were reintroduced, and this part is called the Second Republic, which started the transition of school laws. Just by looking at all these graphs, then you see how long it takes to really change a school system, and how long the roots are still visible from this time when Empress Maria Theresia introduced the compulsory school system. And in 1962, that was the next important date, because a parliamentary decision was taken that school laws have to be dealt with like constitutional laws, which should safeguard the interests of the political parties and the provinces, because it was tried to avoid that something like that in the Second World War or in times of Nazism, that one person or one party could suddenly change school laws. So there has been the coalition, the two strong parties, and only if both of them agreed, they could reach the two-thirds majority, which could really change this school law, since it had become a constitutional law. And the present school organization law was introduced in 1962 as well, which is the school organizational law, as it is called here, SCHOC, School Organizational Law. And in 1974, it was the SCHUK, the School Teaching and Learning Law, was introduced, which was the foundation of the present law on teaching and learning in schools. So these are the relevant dates, which are still the cornerstones for what makes the Austrian school system work the way it works now. Let's look at some historic events as well in a bit more depth. The influence of the monarchy in the school system through the two world wars hampers the modernization of the school system. Moreover, the new republic was a compromise because politicians didn't want to fall back into a situation like it was in World War II. So Austria became the most centralized federal state and the most federal centralized state. And you always have severe tensions between the Ministry of Education, which is the centralized body, and the provinces, which of course try to make the influence of the regions dominant. So parliamentary decisions, as I told you before, are school laws that have to be dealt with like constitutional laws, which means one single party will never stand a chance to change the school system. You always have to have the coalition partners to reach the 2/3 majority. But this will, in main decisions, rarely happen because the two parties, main parties like the Conservatives and the Social Democrats, they have different philosophies and ideologies on how the school system should be organized. Whereas the Social Democrats favor comprehensive education, the People's Party favors more the traditional German-like arrangement with the grammar schools and to have this big divide between the two school types at the age of 10 years after 4 years of primary school. So educational policy is always the result of negotiations and compromises between government, provinces, unions under the auspices of the political parties. So still you find nowadays a very strong influence of the political parties, which can of course be seen, for example, if a school leader, principal is elected and selected, that the influence of the parties play a role there. So policy effects are slow and fundamental change, therefore, is rare. And this again is due to what I said before. It's the most centralized federal state. That means the government sets the syllabus, brings in all the laws, but it's also the most federal centralized state. That means the center always needs the provinces to implement those new laws. So there is this tension which I mentioned beforehand, and it depends always how you look at them, which this image should give you the perspective of. So in the provinces, you would always hear from people, the ministry should pass on their power to the provinces because they know better how to deal with things locally and regionally. And the ministry people would say the provinces don't follow suit because they hinder innovation, because they need them if they want to implement new school laws. This is why for the last couple of years reform steps have been undertaken, or at least suggested by stakeholder groups. Not all of them have been implemented so far. The criticism was that the present system is too bureaucratic, too strongly regulated in details, hierarchically organized, and little output oriented. That's why suggestions for reforms are made, that the new system should build on school autonomy and their systemic control of outcome rather than input. Secondly, the criticism was that the present system has too many actors, many parallel structures, too little congruence in task orientation and responsibility. And what is aimed at is minimizing administrative structures. And if you look at the negotiations between the present political parties who try to find a solution for the Austrian school system, you will always come about these topics: school autonomy, control of outcome, minimizing administrative structures. But this has been going on for a long time. And if we look at the Austrian school administration, I'll show you a graph of the simplified version. Oh, it doesn't seem to appear here. The simplified version is a very colorful mix of different influences between policy and practice. And therefore, Austrian policy culture has to build on social partnerships, because it's the only way to have an influence, because individual partners, individual policies cannot change things or bring in innovation which cover the whole of Austria. Therefore, still nowadays, you have a strong influence of the social partners. That means the different actors in the system, be it economy, be it the employees, be it the church, and party politics, which I mentioned several times that they are very influential. Then the teachers' union and the teacher representatives. And this is why the system builds on negotiation and bargaining. And there is less influence of parents, students, researchers, or other actors like NGOs, which is different from other countries where parents and students and researchers have bigger voices than in Austria. So, for example, if I, as a researcher, want to have an influence on what happens in school, I have to move up to one of those 4 actors groups, either the social partners, the party politicians, or the teacher union or teacher representatives, to get a voice in the whole system. And therefore, it's important that these groups always have to find partners. So they have, for example, to form themselves as social partners, like all the parents of Austria, who are organized in a way that they become part of the negotiation and bargaining process, and in this sense have an influence on all of that. Now, after having looked at the background, I'll give you an overview of the Austrian school system as such, which has a high level of parent choice, but this parent choice is more theoretical, because parents are very much driven by the structure of the system. Well, as in most countries, it starts with kindergarten, which is not really compulsory, although politicians want to make kindergarten compulsory, particularly in the cases if the children don't speak German. This is a fairly new development because of refugee situations, migration movements, etc. Then school starts at the age of 6, in the fall of when they turn 6, and they go through 4 years of primary school. This is the only part in Austria, these 4 years, where schooling is compulsory, where schooling is comprehensive, because students, pupils, usually go to this primary school in the community where they grow up. And then, and this is fairly unique among only few countries left and very typical of the German situation, that there is a decision between should these young people go to a so-called new middle school, NMS, or to the gymnasium, which is the academic secondary school called AHS, Allgemeinbildende Höhere Schule, general education on the higher level. And if they enter this, these are 8 years leading up to the school leaving exam, which is called Matura or Abitur in Germany, and goes back to the Latin word mature, which means ripe, being ripe to finish on this high level. So these students who want to go to academic secondary school, to the gymnasium, cannot do that by free will only, because they have to prove that they are intelligent enough, that they have the achievement which is necessary to get there. And you see the number of the student is about 1/3 of the whole population. If you looked at across a school, a year cohort, which actually are allowed to get to the gymnasium. The other 2/3 stay in the new middle school and have 4 years there. And after 4 years, they have the chance to move on either to 5 years technical, vocational, and general educational schools. That means it takes them 1 more year to get to the Matura, to the school leaving exam. Or they go to an intermediate technical vocational school, which lasts for 3 years. Or, and this marks the compulsory school age, namely 9 years of schooling are compulsory. And this graph shows, if you go along the black line, there is federal legislation, which is true for all the schools, but for these schools which are covered under these black lines, they are under the provincial administration. And you see, I mentioned that there is always the tension between federal level and provincial level. So, for example, if teachers want to be recruited in those schools, it will be done on a regional level. In the other schools, which are governed by the ministry, it's the federal legislation and administration which counts. That means teachers are employed directly through the federal legislation and administration. The same applies for apprentice schools, which again last 3 years there. So this is the overview of the system, but it also shows that there is highly critical equity issues in lower secondary due to the selection at age of 10. There's only 3 years left in the world where selection takes place so early. And of course, there has been arguments going on ever since Glöckl, who in 1918, as a minister, tried to introduce comprehensive education. But until now, the system has not decided on having comprehensive schooling like most countries in the world have. Now, let's move on. This is the schools for the 10 to 14-year-olds, which are, as you look again at this overview, we have an overlap of these 2 school types, and they belong partly to the provincial administration, which is the new middle schools. They have used to have ability grouping, were preparing for the working world, had a low social status. The teacher education was not at university, but at university colleges, and the responsibility was at the municipality level. On the other hand, if you look at the AHS, the Gymnasium, it's no ability grouping. The teachers are university trained, is of a higher prestige, and the responsibility is the federal government. So you had the big problem that you had two school types for the same segment in the world of Austrian education, and these students would never meet after they had left primary education. And this is where the new teacher education program and policy came in, which was introduced in 2015, and we are still in the middle of its implementation. As you can see now, that teachers are trained for NMS and AHS, for both school types, have a university-based teacher education, which is the first step in aligning the two professions, teaching at the same level of the school system. Apart from that, several other reforms have been going on, partly because of the PISA large-scale assessments, because they have shown that similarly to Germany, Austrian students were not that successful and rather average compared to other OECD countries and those which were covered by the PISA assessments. Yeah? That's why for the first time standardized tests were introduced at the years of 4 and 8, meaning at the end of primary and at the end of lower secondary education. But the results were not publicized or centralized, or the centralized final exam, which was also standardized, because they didn't want to have rankings among the different countries. The problem still arises that we have selection criteria at an early age, and this is particularly crucial for children with non-Austrian background, and especially the ones with very limited language knowledge, namely up to, and in some schools even 90% of the students in Vienna, new middle schools, would have a migration background and have difficulty with the German language. And this is why this system of having two different types of schools is so crucial, because most of these students will not be accepted at the gymnasium and would end up in the new middle school. And this is now where the Pädagoginnenbildung neu, where the teacher education new comes in. It was the most fundamental reform of teacher education in Austria almost since Maria Theresia. That's why I wanted to show you the long history and the sources of that. It brought the switch to the Bologna reform, which made the curricula conform to the Bologna architecture, which had not been the case so far, because the medical studies and teacher education were exceptions from Bologna so far in Austria. Then it asked for a cooperation between teacher education colleges and universities. That means the almost differentiated system between two different strands of teacher education have to be aligned somehow. And the aim behind this reform is also to highlight the social and societal significance of the teaching professions, because teachers had not had that high a reputation, at least seen among themselves. And another important reform, it's only 3 types of teacher education programs, which is quite unique, even worldwide, that you have teachers for primary level, for secondary general level, and secondary vocational level. Yeah? So there's no differentiation like in other countries between lower and upper secondary education, etc. Now, scientifically based continuum, a professionally oriented continuum of teaching profession looks in numbers like this. We start with a bachelor, which lasts 4 years, which is 240 ECTS credit points, which is longer than in most countries, because most study programs have a 3-year bachelor. It leads to a Bachelor of Education, and then followed up by a master program leading to a Master of Education, which for primary education lasts 1 year, for inclusions 1.5 years, 60 to 90 ECTS. In secondary general, 2 years with 120 ECTS credit points, and in secondary vocational education, 1 to 4 years. Then the induction phase, which means getting into the teaching profession, is another year before you are a fully fledged teacher and eventually can go to continuous professional development, or you go in for a PhD program. So if we have an overview, you see what happens here in Innsbruck, where we have the study program for teacher education in the west of Austria, if you still have the map of Austria in mind. So we have the bachelor in primary level, vocational level, and secondary general level. And then you put the master program on, which is 1 year on the primary and secondary vocational level, and it's 2 years on the general secondary level. And then you have the induction phase, but this is more or less repeating what we had beforehand. With this graph, I want to show you how things have changed. What you can see is the dotted lines with the broken lines. They show how much the number of input in the study programs have been added. So by having a bachelor and master in primary education, where so far there has only been a 3-year bachelor study program, it's an increase of 66%. In the secondary general study program, it's an increase of 33%. In the vocational area, again, 66%. And then, of course, you have, and this is all new, upgrades of study program. You can do additional study programs, you can do specialization, you can do extra master programs, for example, in the area of school management, mentorship, and you can have your own PhD study program. And the idea was that Austria was divided into 4 different sections, where the universities have to link up with the university colleges of teacher education, which originally were responsible for the Hauptschule or new middle school. They have now to compose their joint teacher education programs. And this is the cluster for Austria, the West network on the secondary level. On the right-hand side, you can see, apart from the Leopold Franzl University of Innsbruck, it's 3 university colleges, which is KPH, which is the religious one, because the church still have their university colleges. Then the Pädagogische Hochschule Tirol for the whole province of Tirol, and the Pädagogische Hochschule for Vorarlberg, which is the westernmost province, as you can see over here. And because music teachers are prepared by universities for particular studies, it's the Universität Mozarteum, which is a branch of the Salzburg Mozarteum, which plays a role here. What you can see on the map in the western part as well is that you see the orange, fully orange part, and there is a lighter orange part. And the lighter orange part actually belongs to Italy. It's South Tyrol, which used to belong to Austria until the First World War, but after the First World War became part of Italy, although it was a German-speaking part. And for the long tradition, since they did not have their own university, so teachers for that German-speaking part, if they wanted to do so, they study at Innsbruck University. So in this university, in our teacher education program, we not only prepare teachers for the Austrian West sector here, but also for this northern part of Germany, which is the German, northern part of Italy, which is the German-speaking part of it. Yeah? So South Tyrol is mentioned here, as you can see, and the distribution of partners. To succeed in putting all these new challenges into the university system, I was lucky because I became the founding dean of the so-called School of Education, which I thought important to have a faculty as such, which just deals with teacher education. Which is the only one in Austria which has really the status, the exactly same status as all the other faculties, which of course can now highlight the professional part of teacher education, whereas previously all the students in secondary education mainly had their home in their subject areas where they studied. And now the educational parts and the Fachdidaktik, the subject didactics, are now studied in the School of Education, and we can therefore also have research and PhD program. So this is the new School of Education, which coordinates teacher education study programs, which are offered in cooperation with 8 other additional faculties where students have to do their subject areas. It has a focus on research in the fields of education theory and classroom practice, as well as on subject-specific teaching approaches and techniques. It offers courses in pedagogy, teaching practice, subject-specific education within teacher education at secondary level, coordinates teacher education at secondary general level within the teacher education network, which I told you about in the western part of Austria. And it cooperates closely with all institutions involved in the training and further education of teachers in particular with the regional education authorities and teacher education colleges. This has been a quick run through the Austrian school system, and on top of it, teacher education. And this link will help you to find out more in the English language on the particular areas which I touched so far. I hope you had the chance to follow me through that, and you're all welcome now to come up with questions, comments, other things you think are interesting or important by using the chat function of your program. And thanks for sharing your time with me going through the Austrian school system. Now, Vasilis is asking, does this new teacher education reality in Austria contribute to the emerging Europe? Do you see any influence coming from the European policy sphere? Yes, thank you, Vasilis. This is a vital point. I have not really ventured into the European dimension, but this, of course, is quite essential for Edite. The first answer would be that the Edite project, which goes back to the European network of teacher education policies, has contributed to introduce this particular PhD program at the School of Education here in Austria. And it actually is the first and only PhD just for teacher education. And this, of course, is very much in line with the European idea, because, as I said before, Edite is part of it. And secondly, it should also be a kind of front runner for other Austrian universities to join up. And for me, the Edite fellows are important change agents in this phase. And we could see, for example, with Gilla being here in Innsbruck right now, that she is mixing the Austrian students by feeding back her findings or answering questions. And you, Vasilis, yourself have been contributing a lot into the departmental and also to the school at large as far as internationalization and Europeanization is concerned. I personally, of course, have always tried to work on this European level, particularly doing some research on what is a European teacher, and we are continuing this. And in this sense, Innsbruck University and the School of Education can have a formative effect on the overall system. But still, there is lots to do because, as we know, teacher education programs are very much geared towards the country of origin, and we have a very low mobility among all the other courses within Europe because exactly of that fact. So, Malte, in which area in the field of Austrian education, if you could name one, do you see necessary future developments and why? Well, good point. One critical issue is that because of the centralized tradition going back to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, The system has been very centralized, so school leadership has not really had a long tradition of leadership. Schools were originally mainly administered, but not led. School leaders have very little influence on what is happening in their schools because the teachers have a lot of independence, and school leaders were in a situation of being primus inter pares. So they were just teachers who originally didn't have any extra training, but because of seniority took over the school leader's position. And nowadays, of course, because of growing autonomy, because of the increasing heterogeneity of the population, there are no central solutions for what can happen at each school. So the only way how this would work is by expand autonomy, and the more autonomous schools are, the more leadership becomes a responsibility to take initiative and see how you can lead the school into a desired future. And at the same time, and this is also something which is still in progress, because we have this change from input, from a governance system which was mainly input oriented, which has been moving to output orientation. How can you actually measure, so to speak, output? And it's a weakness, of course, only look at test results or look at grades students have. You need to have more substance of what the young people actually learn in schools. So, two big areas to work on. Yes, Malte, this is why it's important that we have research in this area, and you are somebody who is really contributing to new findings in how to make school leaders more successful in leading a school towards desired aims. Any more questions? Then please type them in, or needn't just be questions, it can also be comments if you want to add those. There don't seem to be any. Is there anything? Shaima. Yes, Shaima. Thank you, Shaima. Good to have you at the other end as well. Hope it has helped everybody to learn a bit more about the complexity based in the history of the Austrian school system. Sorry, what did you say?
No, I was just looking if somebody's typing, so you can see at the bottom if somebody is
maybe other Edite partners. Yes, we would find that a good idea if other Edite partners come up with an explanation like this, so that whenever somebody wants to refer to the background of the system when he or she does a comparative study, that they would have something similar. And this idea was developed here among the Innsbruck community of Edite, because I had done that beforehand, and the fellows thought that would be worth for others to share. And I thank you for sharing your experience with us here. But you can make those suggestions at your end of the Edite system. And I asked the researchers, the responsible researchers in the partner universities, and they were quite keen and eager to do something like this. We have made a start now and see how others follow suit.
So if nobody has another question, we can...
Yes, if nobody else wants to comment or come in, thanks. I'm looking, there is Helena, Malte, Shaima, Tomasz, Vasilis, and Kwek Wang from China, who is here as well. Good to have you all, and thanks for sharing the time. And whenever some questions come up, you can always come back to me, and you will have the PowerPoint available. We will distribute it so that you can still look at things in more detail, and you can look things up at this link on the last page which I showed you.
Chao Wang is typing something maybe? Or she's
No, thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Oh, good. Thank you for your comment. Yeah. So,
Okay.
all the best wherever you are. Take care, and looking forward to seeing you all at the other end. Ciao.
Thank you very much. So, yes, what we can do
Camera
now
is still on.